Hello, and welcome to Think for Christ. I'm Andrew Payne, and today we are discussing how the classical theist approaches Scripture and divine revelation. So now, to begin with, there is a certain kind of approach to knowledge that is assumed in all of this. Anthony's done a fantastic job of outlining this in previous videos, and so for the most part, I'm going to be assuming things that he's already talked about. However, to some degree, I'm going to have to talk about these as well. Nevertheless, to begin with, we're talking not just about any knowledge, but we're talking about the knowledge of God. And that's an important distinction to make, precisely because the knowledge of God traditionally is understood as having been broken into two basic categories. The first is going to be the knowledge of God, which can naturally be known, which is generally speaking called natural theology, unsurprisingly there. And the second kind is really theology proper, or revealed theology. Now this, of course, unsurprisingly again, requires a special revelation beyond what can naturally be grasped. Right? Today, what we're dealing with is not the natural theological issue, but rather the revealed theology, how we come to know God through revelation, and the kind of status that the divine revelation has within our understanding of things. So, to begin with, we're focusing on specific kinds of knowledge here. Now, there are two kinds that we can point to, namely that which is knowable by natural principles and that which is knowable by supernatural principles, or which requires something additional beyond the natural principles. So a kind of supernatural principle in an analogical sense would be in comparison to I might know something like a tree by encountering it, but the kind of real deep scientific knowledge that I understand requires a teacher to come to me and explain what a tree is to me. Well, it's only more so when we turn to the issue of God in his person, in his triune person. You see, this requires a special kind of revelation. This requires a special kind of teacher. Not just any teacher can teach me this. In fact, only one teacher can teach me this, and that is God himself. He has to come and he has to reveal himself in his triune person and character to me. Now, this, of course, raises the status of, or the question as to the status of this kind of knowledge in terms of its scientific relevance. But before I get into that, let me go ahead and say that the way we use science today is quite different from the way the medievals would have used it themselves. I know you're probably thinking, "No kidding, are you? That's shocking. I couldn't possibly understand. No dip, Sherlock." Right? Now, the fact of the matter is, though, the way science was understood back then wasn't so much that it differed in terms of method or anything like that. Of course, the scientific methodological innovations of the modern era have yet to occur, but really what changes the use of our word science has less to do with the development of the scientific method and more to do with a philosophical change in the priority of what we understand as knowledge. You see, really the point that I'm getting at, in a nutshell, is really a linguistic point. I'm not trying to criticize science in the name of some arcane dogma that I happen to hold. It's really that I'm pointing out that the way that they used the term back in the medieval period is just simply different from how we use the term today. You see, today, again, we think of something in terms of a kind of methodological approach to knowledge itself, whereas they just kind of used it in terms of knowledge in general. Because, you see, our word science comes from the Latin scientia, and scientia just means knowledge. You can have a couple of other words as well that mean knowledge as well, but generally speaking, science, or scientia, is just talking about knowledge. And what the scholastics were interested in is a whole bunch of different modes of knowing. So when they talk about a scientific kind of knowledge, they're talking about a specific way in which we come to know, a specific mode of knowing. Now, this mode is also not necessarily per se, anyway, methodologically defined, right? It's more defined in terms of the mode by which we approach an object. So in this sense, you could refer to an artist in terms of their aesthetic approach to the object as just as scientific by this sort of more classical understanding of science as you would have, the natural scientist by our contemporary understanding approaching the same object in terms of its material composition. Ultimately, these are just two different modes of approaching the same object. And All modes of approaching the object yield some kind of knowledge, and so are in some sense a kind of scientific thing by this classical sense. Now, obviously, that's a significantly different way to approach the term science. But I also don't want to give the wrong impression here, because I don't want you to think that the scholastics just said any old knowledge claim was valid, and that all knowledge claims were equally weighted. They certainly did not. For them, they are following the order of existence. You see, existence itself is structured. There are things that are more prior than others in the order of existence. So, for example, my humanity, I am a human being, but I'm not just a human being in virtue of my material composition. I am formally a human. I have a nature that is embodied in the material composition of me. So there's at least two different principles at work that can be studied: my material body and the human nature which causes this body to be human. There are two different things there, and there's many more. You can study things in terms of aesthetic degree, as I mentioned earlier, as well with the painter. So the point being that if you start following up the hierarchy of being and approaching sciences in that way, what you're very quickly going to see is that not all sciences are equal. In fact, the more abstract the science, the more ontologically prior, which is to say the more fundamental of these sciences in relation to their existence, is going to be weighted higher than all other sciences. So, with this being the case, we're talking about the knowledge of God as required by revelation. You see, I mentioned earlier that there is natural theology and revealed theology. Natural theology is considered by the scholastics and by the ancients to be essentially the highest place that human reason can possibly achieve on its own. It is the highest knowledge of the very first and most fundamental principles of all existence, namely, that which is necessary to bring any created and contingent thing into existence is going to be the most fundamental principle that you can talk about. And so this is natural knowledge. And if we approach it through the lens of the Westminster Confession, this is exactly how the Westminster Confession opens up. And it says, and I quote, "Although the light of nature and the work of creation and providence do so far manifest the goodness, wisdom, and power of God as to leave men inexcusable, yet are they not sufficient to give the knowledge of God and of his will, which is necessary unto salvation." Now that's how the Westminster Confession of Faith opens up. And that's a view ultimately that is drawing from the entirety of the scholastic history, but also really going back into ancient thought in general. That it requires, that what is naturally known by God is simply that he exists. When they refer to his power in the Westminster Confession, this is really talking about God's existential work as manifested in creation, which is really his creative power. Right, so we're talking about, in that sense, what can be naturally known. We look at nature and we see, this is contingent. And since nature is contingent, then what we need in order to explain it is something that is not contingent, something that's necessary. If my existence is such that I did not cause myself to be, well, it follows from that if I didn't bring myself into existence from the void, where am I getting my existence from to sustain myself in existence? And so the scholastic and ancient way to approach this was to say, well, it's the power of God. God did not contingently exist. In fact, he's the one that necessarily exists, and therefore he is the one that gives us our existence. And so if we are all contingent beings, it follows necessarily that there must be a necessary being in order for there to be any actual existence at all. Now, this is a very quick run through and somewhat sloppy, if I do confess, to what Aquinas talks about in his 5 ways, or what's known as the cosmological argument. Don't want to get too far in a digression. Some of you may have heard the rather ridiculous response to the cosmological argument that who made God is usually the way that it's phrased. Now, the ultimate point here is that God is the uncaused cause. And so if you're asking who made God, you're asking who caused the uncaused cause, and that's incoherent. So the reason why people ask that question, to further the digression, is because a guy by the name of Gottfried Leibniz came up with another form of the cosmological argument that is usually confused with what Aquinas is talking about. These two are not the same, so before you just quickly dismiss this as an outdated argument, note that the one that's usually dismissed as an outdated argument is Leibniz. It's not Aquinas, and they are two very different arguments. Now, that's a digression. So to move back to the natural knowledge of God, the natural knowledge of God is, generally speaking, that he is good, that he is the principle of wisdom, the author of wisdom, that his power is expressed in creation, things like this, that he necessarily exists. These are the kinds of things that are naturally known by human reason. You could really just summarize these to say that what is naturally understandable by human reason is that God exists. The difference, though, is that this doesn't tell us who he is. And the who he is what's given to us by revealed or special revelation here, by revealed theology. And this transcends all natural human ways of understanding. You see, this gives us the knowledge that he is triune, and who he is in his person, or his triune person rather, and his character. As the Westminster describes it, it's also that which is necessary unto salvation. And salvation, for those who are theologically inclined, is always going to be understood in relation to God and man, the way that these two are reunited. All right? And this is important for a lot of reasons. Because, you see, today there's a problem of justifying Scripture in our contemporary understanding because Scripture doesn't operate in a standard sort of scientific way. You see, there's a medieval principle that is at work here in all medieval estimations of science. To put it in a technical way, that principle is form follows telos. Now, telos is the Greek word for what a thing ultimately is, the ultimate purpose or fruition of a thing. And form is really just to talk about the nature of the thing. All right? So the principle of form follows telos is to say that what a thing is ordered to what it is to become. Aristotle famously is supposedly said to have given the example of how an acorn turns into a tree, grows into a tree. The tree, the fully grown tree here, is the telos of the acorn, even if it's not actually present, or rather, even if it's only virtually present in the acorn when we hold up an acorn, the telos of this acorn is still going to be this fully grown tree. I think a better example, just for the intuitiveness for us, is to say, take a knife, right? And so a knife ultimately has one telos, one final ultimate purpose that shapes it, and that defines it. And that purpose is cutting, right? So you can then, though, look at a knife and say, all right, well, the entirety of it, everything about it, its shape, its design, its structure, the materials out of which you make it, everything about the knife is ultimately ordered to this purpose of cutting. It's a bad knife, for example, if it's dull. It's a bad knife, for example, if it's made out of paper, right? These are not very good things to make, or paper's not a good thing to make a knife out of, and so it rather is against the telos of the knife. It's against the purpose of the knife to make it out of paper, and therefore it's a bad knife if it's made out of paper. It's a good knife, by contrast, if it's made out of metal, because this really suits the purpose of a knife. So science ultimately, for the medievals, follows upon this principle. This might be the axiom that they're going to be following. Form follows telos. And so you can study, though, knives in a range of different ways according to this classical scientific understanding. If you're talking about its design, for example, you can talk about it in terms of, again, its aesthetic degree. And this aesthetic degree would have to do with all the I'm sure many of you have seen beautiful knives, ornate knives, ones that have interesting shapes and so forth. There are also, if you've ever cooked, you know that there's different shapes for different kinds of tasks that these knives are applied to. So you have the cooking knife that has a unique shape. And so there are different sciences that go into these to ultimately form this one perfect sense of a knife. So we should ask then, from this principle of form follows telos, what's the telos of Scripture? What is Scripture ultimately ordered to achieving? And we can already just break this down in terms of the term that we always associate with Scripture, namely theology. The science that Scripture is linked to is theology. And what is this? Well, theology just means the science of God. Not really surprising there. And so if theology is the science of God, then the telos of Scripture isn't just God per se, but rather the knowledge of God. That is going to be the definition of what this kind of scriptural knowledge is ordered to. So the teleology is going to be, again, our human knowledge of God. We're knowing him in his triune person, knowing him in his character, his his salvific plan and his salvific work, the way in which he links himself back to us through salvation, the way he recovers us through his salvific work whereby he saves us. Now, this is important because this gets confused a ton in the present age, and it doesn't just get confused by maybe what we might call secular academics who aren't particularly concerned with the particulars of Christian theology, but rather it gets confused even by preachers and the everyday layperson in the pews. And so to be able to explain what's going on here, I have to give another sort of scholastic and ancient line of reasoning. And that is the way they thought about the good, not just science, but the good. What is good? What is goodness? What does it mean to be good? And we always approach this through the question today of what is it good for? And that question is a good question, I think, to help us figure out what we or how we approach things in the metaphysical sense of the word good. You see, for the ancients and the medievals, there's a hierarchy of goods. For them, again, we need to point to the telos of a thing, and that which moves a thing closer to its ultimate purpose, its ultimate good, is... Sorry, I kind of got ahead of myself. That which moves a thing to its ultimate purpose is good for it, because its ultimate purpose is its highest good. That's essentially what is going on here. So let's take another example. Let's take the example of food. So what's the ultimate telos of food? Well, you could say something like flavor, but that's not quite right, because oftentimes flavor goes with foods that are not good for us, right? Unfortunately. In fact, more often than not. But nevertheless, the telos of food is ultimately life. Life is the telos of food, because it's meant to support it, to nourish it, to aid it, to make it perdure or endure rather across time. And so food having its telos of life can still be studied in a number of ways. We can still study it in terms of its aesthetic presentation, its taste. We can study it in terms of its nutritional elements. We can study it in terms of what material elements it's made out of, how much protein is in it, for example. And so we can understand it in all of these different capacities, but all of them are ultimately still going to be measured by life as the principle that orders what we understand as food. I do not understand a rock as food, for example, precisely because there's no nutritional value in it. It does not aid life, and in fact, it's now an absurd thing to even bring up because we recognize how far it falls outside of the boundaries of what's proper to food. Now, within this, though, we have to recognize that we've used the term good in two different ways. And these ways should be pretty easy for us to grasp because they're generally speaking understood as there's that sense of the word good, which is the end in and of itself. That's the first one. The second one is that notion of good, which is rather a means to an end. All right? So an end in itself and a means to an end. These are the two forms of the good that you can talk about coherently. Now, all means to ends are practical goods. Practical goods just mean means to ends, or rather tools for achieving our ultimate tasks. All right? So a tool is really a practical good. But then there's also the things which are goods in and of themselves, and these are just teleological goods. They are the end in and of themselves. They're not good for the sake of something else. They're good in and of themselves. All right? Now, here's the thing. Today, the good is universally understood in terms of practicality. And this is a bit of a problem for us because when we ask the question, what's it good for, we always require, in our default way of thinking today, some kind of practical explanation. If you cannot give a practical justification for a good, what's then understood is that you've just said that this thing is worthless. If you can't give a practical justification, you can't give any justification. And this is a very impoverished sense of the good, because that means that we have a world of means to ends and no ends, and that's incoherent, ultimately. And so if we don't give a practical justification, again, it's usually understood as just being worthless. And the worthlessness of this is, I think, an impoverishment of our own understanding. And the classical theist, though, rejects this. The classical theist says, actually, there's another category that's going unobserved. You see, the classical theist says that there is the good beyond the practical. And the good that is beyond the practical is, again, the good that is good in and of itself. It doesn't look beyond itself for its justification. It's just per se good. Let's go back to the example of food. You don't then ask, but why is life worth upholding here? Sure, food is good for life, and we achieve our practical justification of good by ordering it to life, but what's life good for? You don't ask that. That's the end in and of itself. It's the full terminus, the absolute conclusion of the matter. Life is just simply good. But we need to also recognize that there's a certain sense in which it's perverse. We can put it this way. It's perverse to denigrate a good that is good in and of itself to a lower form of the good. You see, if you take something that is practical and you say that it's worthless, we recognize the perverseness of that. It's like, no, it's practical for this good. If you don't recognize the practicality, something's wrong with you. And it's not something's wrong with the practicality, something's wrong with you. Well, it's the same way when we talk about the higher goods. You see, the higher goods, such as goods in and of themselves, are also perversely denigrated if we demand that they justify themselves in some kind of practical sense. Think about it. Are we just to say that, for example, a family is something that's good in and of itself? Are we just to say that family is reduced to a tool for some other purpose? Are we just to say that children are ultimately reducible to a tool for some other purpose? There's something naturally abhorrent to this kind of thinking. And so necessarily there must be things that are good in and of themselves, terminus points for our reasoning about the good. But universally today, in terms of the sermons that you're going to hear something along the lines of the demand for a practical application. This is something kind of perverse to the classical theist, precisely because you're taking the revelation of God, which is meant to reveal Him, and you're reducing it to something that is a lesser good. And furthermore, there's a kind of obvious inference to be made in terms of the question of telos. If form follows telos, if the nature of a thing follows its ultimate fruition, is ultimately ordered to this focal point of its fruition, well, what's the practical application approach to Scripture ordered to, if not our lives? It's ordered to making my life good, or it's ordered to making civilization or saving civilization or something along those lines. And this is then to say that the ultimate end of it revealing some truth about God that we could not naturally understand has been subordinated now to understanding ourselves and our own tasks, which we kind of could understand, right? So the thing is, this is a universal thing done in Christian circles, but it's also done in those sorts of adjacent circles. You can think of Jordan Peterson. Anthony and I just got done going through Jordan Peterson's book, his recent book, and this point came up a lot in that book. But that's namely because Jordan Peterson makes the point repeatedly in his interviews and in the book, pretty late on in the book. He says that the entirety of Scripture is about you. It's about us individually. And if it's not about us, then who's it about, he always asks. Well, the answer is it's about God. That's who it's about. But we can go a step further again, and we can note that Peterson, when he says it's all about you, then also says that the onus or the burden of action is therefore on you, and that's what Scripture is teaching. And so therefore, if it's about you, then the weight of the responsibility is on you. Whereas the traditional Christian understanding is that it is about God, and that the salvific task is therefore, the weight of the salvific task is on Him. That's why it was necessary that Christ, God incarnate in human form, took the burden of sin upon Himself for our salvation. So this is a bit of a thing that Peterson is, I think, taking to its logical conclusion that ultimately, if we really applied the same standard to the sermons that we hear on a regular basis and to much of Christian theology today, we would realize he's actually right there with a lot of contemporary Christian understanding. And all of this is a perversion of what the classical theist really sees as the purpose of revelation, of the Scriptures. So let me conclude, therefore, by highlighting 5 points, just sort of in summary. All right? So the conclusion is, first, in the order of science, revelation, the divine revelation of God embodied in Scripture, is understood as transcendent. It's not that it is below our natural human understandings as some sort of assumption that we have to make. It's rather that it is something that extends far beyond all of our natural ability to understand. It requires God supernaturally aiding us by giving us a revelation beyond what we can naturally understand. So in the order of science, it is transcendent. How about in the order of the good? Well, in the order of the good, this is the second point, the order of the good is that the Scripture in Revelation is just good in and of itself. It doesn't need to justify itself by appealing beyond itself, with this one exception. It is good in itself because what it reveals is the character of God. And so if we were to maybe be really pedantic, we could say that, all right, well, it's good for revealing God. But ultimately, as the person and the character of God are being revealed in it, this is what we mean, that revelation is itself good for that highest possible sense. And so if that's the case, it doesn't need to seek justification for some other reason. Now, the third term is going to be a controversial one within Christian circles, and that is, namely, that the Scriptures are not the ground of our knowledge. It's a popular line today. Jordan Peterson also says this. It's popular among presuppositionalists and Jordan Peterson, namely, that we see Scripture as necessary for resolving all the tensions in our natural human understanding. And so if we are to know anything, if we are to ground our knowledge in something that is certain, to answer the epistemological problems that have popped up in the modern age, then we have to take Scripture as our foundation. And this sounds very pious. In fact, it's one of the things that if you deny today, you're considered to be ultimately impious. It's considered to be one of the ultimate impieties of the contemporary Christian church. But here's the problem with that. You see, there's three terms that I need to stress here. One is the term immanent, the next is the term transcendent, and the third is the term transcendental. All right? None of these three terms are the same, and I think we can grasp it pretty easily by an analogy. The term immanent just means within. So imagine a house. You have a house. I'm in a house right now, right? So you have a house, and this house has an inside, right? What is inside the house is what is immanent to the house, right? But there's an outside the house. There's that which is beyond the house. And that beyond of the house is ultimately what we would mean by transcendent. It's beyond, all right? But what is the transcendental? Well, the transcendental is the walls of the house. It's that which separates the inside from the outside. It's that which ultimately frames what it even means to be inside. And so the transcendental is ultimately not escaping to the transcendent, but rather is just framing what it means to be within the house. So, with that being the case, the Scripture is oftentimes treated as the transcendental framework of our understanding. And hopefully you can see why that's a problem. Because God did not give us our Scripture, or His Scriptures, so that we can better understand ourselves. He gave us the Scriptures so that we can better understand Him, that we can not just know that He exists, but rather that we can know who He is in His person and in His character, and that these are things which are properly transcendent. They're not found within the house. They're not found in the framework of the house. They're found beyond the house, and it's a miracle precisely because He's bringing it within the house in the form of some kind of revelation. All right? That's the miraculous part. So if we treat God as the ground of knowledge, and one of the more famous arguments here that these people put forth is what's called the transcendental argument. But the transcendental argument is really just talking about the framework of our own understanding. God isn't part of our understanding. He doesn't understand in the way that we understand. He transcends it. And so our understanding is naturally limited, requires then God stepping in with this miraculous act. And so revelation is not the ground of our knowledge, it's that which infinitely transcends our knowledge. And this is a huge difference. Now the fourth point, let me back up as well, it's furthermore, again, with that hierarchy of goods, it is a denigration of the transcendent good of the Scriptures, to reduce it to some kind of transcendental or immanent truth. Now moving on to the fourth point. You see, just as science follows upon first principles, or follows upon principles, the highest science is going to be following upon first principles. Now, theology, following upon transcendent principles, means that it must be necessarily revealed in its special sense. Right? Natural theology does not require it. That's just simply the highest form of human understanding. But revealed theology requires something more. It requires a supernatural addition, namely the written word. And with all of that being said, I want to close now by reading a passage from Aquinas. And this will be the fifth point. Thomas Aquinas writes something I think very good here to help us understand what is at work. And this is his ultimate justification for the nature of Scripture. He writes, and I quote, "I answer that sacred doctrine is a science. We must bear in mind that there are two kinds of science. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the natural light of intelligence, such as the arithmetic and the geometry and the like. There are some which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of perspective proceeds from the principles established by geometry, and music from the principles established by arithmetic. So it is that sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely, the science of God and the blessed. Hence, just as the musician accepts on authority the principles taught to him by the mathematician, so the sacred science is established on principle by the revelation of God. Now, this point about the revelation of God is great to summarize because the grounding of it is God himself. Sacred truths about God require a special teacher. That special teacher is God, and God gave us his revelation as his teaching about himself, about his triune person and his character and his providential salvation of his elect. And that is the classical theist approach to Scripture.